My name is Nick Norboge. I work with the Institute for Transportation Research and Education at NC State. Previous to that, I worked with the Texas A&M Transportation Institute, where we worked very primarily building revenue forecasting models for TxDOT. So trying to pull together as much information as we could to develop very long-term 40, 50-year forecasts for TxDOT, which has ended up kind of morphing over the time because of the growth and development of connected and automated vehicle technology. We kind of throughout that process had to go through and revise our models accordingly. So the subject of my presentation is more on the immediate impacts of COVID-19, but on transportation revenues. But I think it's important because it highlights a particular era of major uncertainty and how that plays into affecting our long-term revenue forecast models. I mean, we build these long-term revenue forecast models, making baseline assumptions of 10%, 4% growth every year, and just kind of projecting those out in the future. And so when we have a major kind of really unexpected event like what has happened with the pandemic over the year and massive effects that has had on people's fundamental behavior associated with just driving, there's certainly impacts related to travel, but because of that, because we are able to, we fund our transportation primarily through motor fuels taxes, state and federal motor fuels taxes. There's clear trickle down impacts that happen as well. So I will go ahead and start my presentation. Let's make sure I can get this going. Okay.
Dr. Norboge, do we have a copy of your presentation?
Yes, I believe one was sent out. If not, I'd be happy to send one along so that you'll have copies of it.
I see. Stacy, do you have a copy?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Are we recording?
Yes.
Okay.
Dr. Norboge, if you don't mind, we are also recording your presentation, that we will share it with folks that are not able to join.
Okay, great. Trying to get the right screen here. Okay. So just a little bit of background. For much of the 21st century, North Carolina in particular has experienced extraordinarily robust economic growth. The state's gross domestic product, for example, has grown significantly. It's outpaced economic growth experienced even in some southern and southeastern states. The amount of growth that has taken place in the state is truly extraordinary. And some contributing factors to this include things such as quality of life, relatively low cost of living, particularly along the East Coast, available land that is there for development, and an extremely skilled workforce with numerous educational institutions that are here in NC State, UNC, North Carolina A&T. I mean, there's so much education opportunities that are here in North Carolina that have brought talent from across the country here. So as a result, the state has experienced extraordinary population growth, which you can look at it from an economic perspective, has increased the supply of transportation revenues. So more folks moving to the state, more folks buying cars, driving, so they're consuming gasoline and diesel for larger trucks. And so what it has done is it has increased the supply of transportation revenues, but also has increased the demand. From 2010 to 2019, the state's population has outperformed the nation basically 2 to 1, having grown about 10%. Coupled with this change, aggregated vehicle traffic has also increased substantially on the state's major arterials, but across the state's transportation network. And then in addition, beyond just highway transportation, there has also been an increase in air traffic transportation. So some of the state's largest international airports, such as Charlotte Douglas International and Raleigh-Durham, have experienced more than double-digit growth in the percentage of passenger employments from 2010 to 2019. Both airports have experienced extraordinary growth. And if you kind of look across we have different transportation modes. Public transportation systems have also grown and have also seen their passenger volumes increase as well. So this is a good chart from NC-DOT that kind of gives a little bit of a high-level overview of kind of different grades of investment that are sort of taking place. And generally what you can take away from this is that the more that we are able to invest in our transportation network, the more economic productivity that we are able to see. So, and also it reduces the cost borne by individual travelers. So, for example, the annual vehicle operating cost for road condition, poor roads means that more drivers have to spend more to maintain their vehicles. A better transportation system with better quality pavement means that there is less per person that is spent. So, and this kind of goes across the board. If we want a more effective aviation system, we need to invest more in capital building improvements, hangars, other runway capacity. We need to look in there. The same goes along the lines for passenger rail, freight rail, and other types of integrated mobility services. This is also a study done by NC-DOT that kind of helps illustrate the differences between needs and revenue. And so we can draw out, this is again, kind of using our traditional models of what we think we have in terms of transportation revenue, coupled with the delta between that and transportation demand, what we think we need. And when we draw that out, we come up with basically an inflation adjusted gap of around $55 billion over the next 12 years. That's significant. That's a lot of additional revenue we're likely going to need to be able to keep up with a likely growing population that's expected to come to the state. And I'll touch a little bit more about, on this graphic and some of the points that follow. So despite this growth, federal and state transportation revenues have remained stagnant. There's a lot of reasons for that. One of the big reasons, again, is the way that we tax transportation consumption through gallons of gasoline purchased. That can work well whenever we have relatively fuel inefficient vehicles, but as vehicles become slowly much more fuel efficient, the number of gallons of gasoline that are purchased begins to decline. And so that puts a pretty significant hurt on the amount of transportation revenues to keep pace with the amount of transportation traffic that we have on the roadways. So, kind of going through different small changes that have happened over time. A small dip in 2001, but even a larger dip in 2009. Air traffic, for example, has grown steadily. That has also provided stable revenue streams in the form of passenger facility charges, landing fees, other types of revenue sources that help to fund mostly large airports. Transportation revenues that support vehicular travel on the other hand, such as vehicle registration fees, so fees that you pay every time you register your vehicle. In many counties, you pay a property tax on that vehicle. Federal and state gas tax revenues and other funding methods, such as the highway use tax, help to go and fund transportation. And while other states have seen relatively small growth in transportation demand, this has not been the case in North Carolina and is representative of a general large population shift away from Rust Belt, northern and Midwestern states down to the Sun Belt states in the South and the Southeast and the West. So, as I mentioned before, recent events have placed significant strain on the state's transportation and infrastructure revenues, and perhaps most significantly, relative to even some of the most recent economic shocks, such as the Great Recession of 2010 and 11, or 2009, 2010, we have not seen such a major impact to transportation revenues as what has occurred with COVID-19. COVID-19 has led to a catastrophic, although somewhat brief from kind of what we're finding in terms of transportation funding, most recently drop in transportation revenues. And as a result of this, the transportation industry has been hit of kind of what I'm calling a trifecta of revenue losses. Declines in federal and state and motor fuels tax, declines in new vehicle purchases, so as a decline in, as the state's economy kind of continues to suffer, fewer and fewer people are buying new vehicles, which is supporting funds to levy the state's highway use tax. And then finally, declines in state sales, local sales and use tax revenue that goes primarily to fund public transportation. And that has placed added strains on public transportation agencies throughout the state. And public transportation agencies are kind of also facing a major impact in terms of fare box revenue. Fewer people are using public transportation, and that's also a source of revenue for those agencies. So the main takeaway here is that according to NCDOT, transportation revenues have declined over 30%. That's significant. That's a significant amount of revenue in the months immediately after COVID. What we're seeing most recently, however, and this is kind of a bright spot for NCDOT and the transportation industry in general, is that we are seeing kind of a rebound for the fourth quarter of 2020 as soon as those revenue numbers are provided. So notably, this sharp decline in transportation revenues has caused a delay in planning schedules. So it's a lot more difficult to be able to plan for, deliver transportation projects when you don't have the revenue that's coming in to be able to support that. Like I mentioned before, however, the good news is that transportation revenues are starting to rebound. However, transportation forecasts project that travel in North Carolina may not rebound to normal forecasted levels for the next short term, possibly longer term. And this is particularly true for public transportation agencies in the state. Revenue ridership on public transportation is down significantly, and that is unclear when that will return. The same is within the aviation industry. We're still not sure how quickly air traffic will rebound in the months and the years to come. So as we look forward to 2021 and beyond, the future of transportation in North Carolina and around the U.S. Does remain uncertain, with some signs of, and this is, again, an area where we are going to start to see changes in how we develop revenue forecast models, structural changes that might be taking place. So, for example, work-related trips that may be impacted for the long term, such as many in the knowledge-based economy that might be able to work from home 1 or 2 days a week. Those people that would normally travel to work 4 or 5 days a week now no longer need to do so. So you have a small, even a relatively small portion of the economy and knowledge-based workforce that only needs to travel to work 1 or 2 days a week. That could have a significant impact on overall travel demand. Airline travel may also experience a long-term impact as companies begin to evaluate the cost benefit of conducting business virtually instead of in person. So as a result, there are major challenges that lie ahead for transportation planners and policymakers, particularly in the area of accurately forecasting future transportation revenue. So for example, COVID-19 has introduced a potential major forecasting error in planning models. We're sort of kind of working with a new element that we may have to consider in the future that could have a drastic effect on how we travel, and we're still unclear whether there may be long-term impacts associated. Second, it's possible that the public may have passed a critical threshold for telework, which again begs the question: how do we accurately account for this loss, replacement, and trips? And then third, the introduction of electric and connected and automated vehicles does introduce a significant level of uncertainty into historical transportation revenue forecasting approaches. Finally, as vehicles become more fuel efficient, as I mentioned before, the potential power for gas tax revenues to sufficiently keep pace with demand may continue to decline. So what we need sophisticated financial models that consider these new uncertainties. We especially need credible financial forecasts to develop approaches for long-term design, planning, and delivery of transportation infrastructure projects. And I do see, and I think that this is a potential opportunity for further PhD dissertations into increasingly providing much more reliable forecasts to best assess the post-COVID-19 aftermath, to help inform policymakers and the public to ensure that transportation projects have the necessary long-term revenue streams associated. So I'll go over kind of a couple of what I think are kind of helpful summaries of looking at the possibilities for connected and automated vehicles, where there seems to be clear advancements in modeling, particularly in modeling travel behavior, and kind of where I see there being a kind of next level opportunity or a derivative opportunity for forecasting transportation revenue. So we have seen extensive research coming out of university transportation institutes across the country, looking at where are some of the behavioral and technology behavioral factors that are going to take place for better understanding some of the impacts of connected and automated vehicles. So, everything related to trip making, vehicle ownership, residential choice, modal split. I mean, these are all factors that will change in a world of connected and automated vehicles. Route selection, there are many different changes in how behavioral factors will lead to where people are going to decide to live, how they're going to decide to work, and what kind of impact that's going to have on our existing transportation infrastructure. Technology factors, vehicle fleet characteristics, automation, performance, communications. These are all factors that will likely have to be taken into consideration. There's extensive work that's currently underway to help kind of flesh that out and develop several more accurate forecasts. These are all kind of areas in which kind of lead us into developing modeling approaches for using what transportation engineers and planners typically use as in its four-step transportation model. So, how are some of these different factors going to impact how we traditionally plan for transportation? Capacity increase in freeways proportional to the adoption rate of connected and automated vehicles. Delay increase in arterials proportional to adoption rates. Travel time sensitivity. Land use assumptions. These are all sort of necessary inputs that are going to lead to changes in how travel behavior is going to change. It's from there then that we can start the process of assessing what those likely impacts will have on transportation revenue. And so this is again, a great opportunity for research. At least from my perspective, I'm starting to see some work that's been undertaken to make the nexus between some of the more advanced thinking for connected and automated vehicle transportation planning efforts will leap over toward what that impact is going to have on transportation likely revenue impacts over time. So I wanted to leave you with a couple of research sources that might be helpful to you and kind of excellent resources to kind of continue to dive into this topic a little bit further. And again, I would love the opportunity to talk with anyone who is more interested in wanting to kind of learn about this topic, particularly those that are working on connected and automated vehicle efforts, modeling efforts, so that we can kind of take that to the next step on revenue impacts. Fortunately, we are working on that right now with as part of the Thrust One effort for research. So we're hoping to kind of flesh that out a little bit further. We're going to be releasing a literature review by the end of the year, and hopefully we can kind of build on that work a little bit further. So that's the summary of my talk, and I'd be open to any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much.
Great.
Very interesting topic and eye-opening about the future challenges that we're going to be facing, and might be opportunities and challenges and opportunities. Thank you. So any question to Dr. Norboge?
Okay, let me ask a few questions about modeling. When you start modeling this, how do you include, for example, the fuel? Now you know that the gas mileage in the cars are going up. In order for the state to make up for the revenue, now they are charging cars that are fuel efficient. Okay, that is one part. Another part is question is going to come why the state should start charging more or trying to have the same amount of funding if they are not going to be replacing the current transportation infrastructure with something better. I mean, the need is going to come from what is it that they are going to be offering new that it is not in place.
Right.
You are forecasting these things. How do you forecast? Because you're going to be working closely with the Department of Transportation and then other stakeholders like air transportation, so on and so forth.
It's a great question. It's interesting because in my experience working at TxDOT or with TxDOT and kind of developing our long range forecast, we always sort of started with a baseline need, where this was kind of a number that we wanted to kind of meet, or kind of a goal that we wanted to try to achieve. What are the different kind of revenue combinations we could get to meet that point? I think what was highlighted with COVID is we had always just assumed that demand was going to continue to tick up with population. But now our models are going to have to be a little bit more dynamic, where we're going to need to kind of take into consideration what if there is a scenario by which demand doesn't increase the way that we are forecasting to align closely with population. And maybe our revenue threshold doesn't need to be as great, but maybe we need to shift fundamentally in the different kinds of things that we may need to invest in. So, for example, I mean, and there's several different scenarios around connected and automated vehicles that suggest that we're going to see everything from, we may see a net decline in vehicle miles traveled to a increase in vehicle miles traveled, meaning that there's going to be lots of zero occupancy vehicles out there that will be sort of traveling with no passengers. So we're kind of having to sort of build our models so that they are responsive to these likely different scenarios. And I think transportation modeling, and I know there's lots of efforts in NC 2040, NC Moves 2040 plan is kind of going in this right direction too, of having multiple different scenarios and then modeling based on those. I think that's going to be kind of the right approach of how we're going to approach transportation revenues, because there could be a scenario which we're seeing lots, a net growth in vehicle miles traveled. Well, that might be a place in which we might need to invest in more capacity. So it's sort of kind of it's an investment decision, it's a revenue decision, and then it's sort of also a demand decision, a demand input, kind of all at the same time.
Thank you.
Okay, I do have one question, Nicolas. Is that presumably we already have some models in place that are going to be forecasting the revenue income, and then all of these models presumably have some sort of tolerance to some crisis that might have been happen. So would it be possible, for example, to have a study to say, to evaluate these models and see how much they were able to handle the kind of uncertainty that was created by COVID-19? And if not, then how those models should be modified so that in the future we're going to have a kind of more accurate estimation and more robust estimation or forecasting if that's going to be happening. That's one question. And then the other question that may be a follow-up to this question is that if we're going to handle this kind of the uncertainties that is quite kind of rare in some situation. I don't know how it's going to be rare, how much it's going to be. Again, we're going to have this kind of experience. But here is the situation. If we're going to handle this much uncertainty in the model is going to be eventually too conservative. That means that we're going to have very, very conservative approach on as far as expenditures, planning, and so on. And that's the other side that we do have. Yes, we have a better model that can handle uncertainty in that scale, but also the side effect is that then the policy making and planning is going to be too conservative too. So how are we going to be handling these problems?
Yeah, it's a great question. Because, and you bring up a good point in that error can also happen on a conservative side too, which is also problematic. So say you're only forecasting transportation revenues to go up 2% next year, and they go up 5 to 6%. Well, you're planning infrastructure projects based on 2% revenue. So all of a sudden you have this influx of cash, which can inhibit and sort of provide challenges to planning in the first place, right? You're sort of trying to do the best. So accuracy is key. I'd love to do a COVID-19 sensitivity analysis on our transportation models. That would be, I'm sure there's going to be lots of studies that are going to be looking at that. And maybe they find that whenever this is kind of all said and done, transportation demand maybe didn't decline all that much, or maybe it was such a small blip that it really didn't matter in the long run, and that even the severity of what had happened, particularly in March, between about March and June and July, really doesn't have any kind of long-term impact or we find that there was a sort of a structural change that has happened that fundamentally alters the overall trajectory and growth that we have in our existing models in the first place. And the answer is I really don't know. You could make a strong coherent argument for both to likely happen. One, a structural change in traveling behavioral will likely result from just changes in being able to conduct more work virtually. Or we find that there's just going to be relatively no impact, and by June and July next year, when we have a vaccine and travel truly becomes back to January and December 2019 levels, that this will be sort of kind of almost an aberration in sort of a long-term transportation model. So I think we'll just kind of have to. I think we're still a little bit in a period of uncertainty in knowing for sure the likely long-term impacts on our models. But I know, at least from a transportation funding standpoint, transportation revenue standpoint, many of these models, some of them are fairly advanced, but some of them really are just kind of a general 5-year, 5% growth annually forecast into the future. I mean, they could use much more rigor and robustness to them to help us get a much more accurate picture of what's going to happen. Because we really do, we really are entering a period of a lot more uncertainty, where in the past, population growth could not perfectly but reasonably provide a likely representation of what would happen for transportation growth in a given area, and that's just not likely to happen in the future as changes in technology, changes in both vehicle technology, but also changes in work behavior. Is just going to provide quite a bit of uncertainty as we try to move forward.
Any question from cyberspace? Student, come on. This is a very interesting topic. All right, while they are thinking, I have a couple more questions. It would be nice if you could share with us a little bit more detail in what goes on when you are trying to do the forecasting. What are the models that you are using? And how, I'm sure when you're forecasting, you always include some degree of uncertainty. How much your model that you had it from last year could have predicted this COVID-19, for example, as far as the revenue concerned? You mentioned 30% it came down, but what about in your forecast, the forecasting model that you had? What are the differences between what is real today and what was it that you were forecasting?
Well, I mean, my forecast model was wrong.
By how much?
I think many of them were. I mean, I'd like to say, and I do know that that NCDOT does use a fairly sophisticated model developed by SAS that has looked at long-term forecasts, and I'd love to, and I'm curious to talk with them and see and get to know a little bit more about what their model is. But I mean, a lot of our transportation revenue forecasting model, I hate to say this, but it's true, is sort of just kind of detailed Excel spreadsheet planning that we've kind of used the past in some ways to roughly project what's likely what has happened in the past and try to draw out forecasts in the future. And so, we have an uncertainty band. I mean, what we forecast out to the dollar of what revenue is going to come from the state's gas tax in 5 years. We know that number is probably going to be wrong. How wrong it's going to be, in the past has kind of been fairly predictable. And it's really possible that for the end of 2020 and even 2021, our overall numbers may not vary all that much. We're still gonna need to get the final revenue data that will come in at the end of the fiscal year to kind of give a detailed number in for certain. But I mean, I do know that our forecast models, or at least some of the ones that I've been kind of keeping an eye on for March 2020, were very wrong. So kind of from a monthly granular point of view, they can be very difficult. Whenever you start to draw them out annually or even kind of on a fiscal year basis, they can kind of start to average out a little bit more. But again, I mean, there's really a good opportunity for your students, for other researchers to really take a look at and think about it in a really systematic way of really improving our revenue models. And then on top of that, being able to model for some of the different revenue options that are being considered out there. So mileage-based user fees are one where instead of levying a tax on gasoline or diesel, you're levying a tax based on the number of miles driven by a vehicle as another alternative. And that sort of kind of presents a whole new way of trying to kind of forecast transportation funding that really kind of hasn't been done before in a real true kind of systematic way. So there's definitely kind of opportunities there for sort of taking it. But yeah, I wish I could kind of say that there are certainly some DOTs that are developing very sort of sophisticated models as they can, but kind of at the basis to them, they sort of are reliant really pretty heavily on transportation traffic demand models.
Hey Nick, this is Thomas. I was reminded in that question about a meeting that we had with NC-DOT where they wanted to know how to adjust the models. But in the meeting that they were talking about for their forecasting, and maybe this is more on the project side for expenditures, but in the very end, when they go talk to the legislature, they do not want a band anymore. At that point, they want a single value. It was a very interesting conversation because there is uncertainty in all models. We know that. But from their perspective, when they go and make the pitch to ask for the money, they have to know an exact figure when they send that request. So that was one interesting standpoint where we know that there is uncertainty, but in the end, the number that they need to provide publicly has to be a single value.
Yeah, right. And I mean, you can do all you can to provide a single value, but one thing that I would know for certain, if I'm going to try to forecast to the dollar next year of how much gas tax revenue, that state gas tax revenue that's going to be levied, I know that number is probably going to be wrong, right? It's really, really difficult to come with that. But you're exactly right, Thomas. Policymakers want to know as closely as possible what number that they can work with, particularly because they are trying to develop let schedules and develop long-term planning out of projects based on the likely financial forecasts that are being developed. So, again, it's not an exact science. The art to it certainly is you're going to be much more accurate in the next year than you are in the next 4 or 5 years. So, kind of drawing out long-term forecasts can continue to be pretty challenging. But that's a great point.
Hi Nick, quick question. I was wondering if you could refer back to your references. I wanted to take like a snapshot real quick, but it went by really fast.
Sure. Let's see.
Thank you.
Yeah, but
Absolutely. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, but this is work that I've been spending quite a bit of time with, particularly in the area of of tolling, which is sort of this whole new area of what are going to be the direct impacts associated with, are we going to see just a small blip in tolling revenue, or are we going to see long-term structural changes in how people drive, and how is that going to affect long-term tolling revenue too? So I think there's a really interesting kind of conversation taking place there as well.